The DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and also all these different federal agencies are coming out with their own kind of memos. But the DHS came out with this memo. Now, this memo is, I believe, a college student had made this, or some type of university had come out with this, and the DHS adopted it. Now, this is the escalation of radicalization. If you look at this, it's kind of like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is at the bottom, you need your food, your shelter, your water, basic physiological needs to survive. Then above that, you need some type of security, like employment, finances. Above that, you need love, community, family. Above that, you need self-esteem. You have to think highly about yourself, respect. Above that is self-actualization. So now you're understanding philosophy, you're thinking about your existence. There's a whole hierarchy of needs. With the escalation of radicalization, this chart at the bottom, there's the Republican Party, Fox News. You go above that, then you have like PragerU, which is like a online university giving out information about, let's say, the presidents, Thomas Jefferson. You have Tucker Carlson, you have the MAGA hat. You go above that and you get to National Socialism. You have certain symbols from folks in World War II, and it keeps escalating. So the whole idea is that all of these memos, by the way, this is not the first time that the DHS or even another federal agency like the FBI has come out and demonized a certain group of people in America based off of their political beliefs. Now, in America, you have the First Amendment right, which means no matter what your belief is, if you want to be a radical extremist, if you want to be a socialist, that is acceptable as per the First Amendment. So all these people in Congress who want to expand all the welfare programs and they want to spend trillions of dollars on solar, and no matter what the reason is, that's a social welfare program that's inflating the dollar, essentially bankrupting America. They can say those beliefs because it's protected by the First Amendment, even though those beliefs are crazy and radical and extreme, and it would completely destroy America. So the First Amendment is protecting that, yet you have federal agencies which are under the executive branch, which is under the federal government, okay? The people who are supposed to, they swore an oath to protect and serve whatever is in the U.S. Constitution as the supreme law of the land. They are going against that now because they're going after people specifically based off their political beliefs. And it's not even radical beliefs, but they're trying to escalate it into a situation where it would be radical. So they're starting with something simple. Okay, where you're getting your news, the conservative news, that's the escalation of radicalization. That's the gateway drug into a situation that could fare much worse. Oh, this political candidate, now you're on level 2. You go above that, this is where you're at. You're aligning yourselves with the same people from the 20th and 19th centuries, mainly the 20th century. So what we're seeing is this is a classic psychological manipulation tool that people have been using for the longest time. Mainly it was used during the 20th century. So when you had a ton of socialism, a ton of communism, this was enacted in Cambodia, and the USSR, and China, tons of different places. What this is first you have to demonize a group of people. Then you dehumanize them. They're not even human anymore. Then after that, because they're not human, you can incarcerate them. You can do whatever you want with them. You can have them do labor. I'm not saying what you should do. I'm saying this is what, if you go back historically, the countries, the people who ran these countries, who were socialists, who were authoritarian, this is what they did. Then after that, they can do extreme acts that, from an objective point of view, no human would be, if you're sane, no human would be okay with. But what happens is these steps are done gradually over time, and they're enacted slowly once culture accepts each step, and it progresses from there. So the first step, you demonize people. So if there are a group of people who are your political opponents, they're a threat to you being in power, even if they're in the right and you're in the wrong, let's say, for all this is based off emotion. So people make decisions based off emotion, predominantly, women more so than men, but all humans in general. So you emotionally manipulate people to demonize a group of people. Then you keep escalating it with terminology, with vocabulary, with language, and you can even adjust language. This is what the North Koreans have done. This is what the Chinese have done. This is what the Russians have done. All countries have done this whenever there was a ruling party that needed to gain leverage over their opponents. Demonize, then they're not even human, okay? I'm trying not to go into the terminology because we're on certain platforms and we have to be respectful to those platforms. Then you go beyond the dehumanization. Like I said, now there's incarceration. You can politically prosecute your opponents. We're already seeing that, actually. We're seeing certain political candidates in the United States of America being politically prosecuted which that only typically happens in developing nations, in third world nations, in nations that we know are corrupt. They have a corrupt administrative state. Now, we have that here to an extent. Actually, it's a huge extent. But now firsthand, American citizens are seeing this right in front of their eyes. The question is, are American citizens going to connect the dots of, oh, they're doing it right in front of my eyes right now. This is something that has never been, it's never happened in America. I believe there was a president who was speeding on his horse in the 1800s. I can't remember his name, McKinley maybe. And he was pulled over, and I think he was thrown in jail for a day, something like that. That was the last time this had happened to a political opponent. We are seeing a raid on people's homes. We're seeing a raid on journalists. We're seeing actively the federal government using their executive power and the different agencies that have the law enforcement agencies going to people who are speaking truth. They're not even saying anything that's incorrect. Even if it were incorrect, that is their First Amendment right. They're not even inciting violence. They're not doing anything like that. They're just speaking out. And these people are being targeted by law enforcement, where the law enforcement is supposed to protect these people's individual rights, not go after them for utilizing their rights. And so now we have people who are being politically prosecuted. We're in that third stage. The next stage, we always talk about the Germans during World War II, but let's look at the Japanese. The Japanese did this to their own kind, but they also did this to prisoners of war. They would run experiments. Just different human experiments that are unfathomable. I'm not going to say what the experiments are. A lot of them, well, I'll give one example. A lot of them, this particular example, it was really cold at the time, and the Japanese wanted to see what would happen if someone got frostbite, and they removed a limb. What would occur? What would happen? This is the time during 1940s, 1930s, and they're just testing. They're just running experiments to cultivate their ideology of what are the results, good or bad. So they would do crazy things, and a lot of it was not justified because there was no purpose. There was no objective intact. There was no, what is the hypothesis? What are we trying to solve for? Is this going to create some new revelation or new science? It's people messing around. So we have a lot of human experiments, which is not okay because you have innocent people, or even if they're not so innocent, cruel and unusual punishment, which you can't do that as per the Constitution. Again, I use the Constitution for pretty much everything, as people already know, as a standard of how we should treat individuals. If you're doing cruel and unusual punishment, you're going beyond the bounds of what is humane. Now, I will say, let's say you're on the side of, I agree with what the federal government is saying. I agree with what the DHS is saying, where you have these people and they're becoming radicalized. Okay, let's say you agree with that. When you agree with that, first ask the question, are they removing individual rights, which are absolute? Individual rights are absolute. There's no if and, there's no give. These are not reasonable rights. These are absolute rights for a reason, so that they cannot be exploited by the federal government. But they're already being exploited. They're being exploited because the federal government can use certain events, manufactured or not, or maybe they're just heavily leveraged, to emotionally compel you to look at these absolute rights and say, yeah, we should make an adjustment here because there's a lot of damage that could be done. That gives more power to centralized authority. When they have more power, that means you have less power. The whole idea of absolute rights is so that you have some kind of power to counteract the power of the centralized authority, because they ultimately have the monopoly on force. And if they have the monopoly on force, they can get you to do whatever they want you to do. Whether it's right, whether it's unreasonable, it doesn't matter. You may have people in power who have screwed up ideologies, and in fact, many of them do. And we acknowledge this historically, but we think that now this time is different. 2023, everything is different. There are still people who chase positions of power. They have screwed up ideals. And sometimes they just want to try things that are fun. And they know that, well, how they view the world, how they perceive everyone is, you're all just peasants. You're all just pawns. I can do whatever I want. I have all this power. I have this network. And because I have more power over you, and because we've effectively eroded your individual rights to such a minuscule degree, we can effectively do whatever we want to you, and you have no recourse. You can't retaliate at all. Even if you tried, well, we could just prosecute you because you're doing something that's unlawful against the federal government. In fact, right now they're trying to pass laws, which would be against the First Amendment, to speak out or criticize health officials, politicians, etc. So when you're okay with this, where the federal government is saying these people are becoming radicalized, ask yourself, are they removing absolute rights? It doesn't matter what the reason is, because the reason can be emotionally compelling. So remove the emotion, divorce yourself, your emotional point of view, from the objective point of view for just 1 second. The answer is yes, they are removing individual rights, and those individual rights are absolute. So therefore, you cannot remove them. You can't find some kind of chink in those rights and start to chip away at them because they're absolute. You can't chip away at even 1% of them. Like I just said, they can be exploited, and there can be leverage held over you. Even if you agree with the ruling party, let's say that ruling party switches. Now that new ruling party, who you don't agree with, has so much leverage over you because you've gone ahead and advocated for the adjustment of centralized authority to have more power over you. Okay, I said that in kind of a intricate way. Let me simplify it. You're a voter. You like the current ruling regime. You like the current political party that's in office. You say, yes, I will give you the power, I'm voting for this, for you to, let's say, chip away at the Second Amendment. Okay, there are some weapons that people should not have, and I agree, so I'm voting for it. That's why I'm voting for you to be in office. Great. Okay, the party makes the adjustment. Now, let's say most guns don't exist. Most guns are not in the hands of people. You can't get them. Now, criminals can still get them. That's a whole separate discussion. Then that political party is out of office. A new political party comes in, and it's a political party that you don't agree with. And now they want to enact actions against you that you don't agree with, and you think it goes against your individual rights. But remember, you've already voted for the federal government because this is a contingency thing. It doesn't just stay with the political party and follow the political party. It follows whoever is in government. It doesn't really follow. It sets a standard for the federal government. So no matter what political party comes in, they have the same powers. Now that new political party comes in, they have leverage over you, and you don't have a weapon to defend yourself, let's say, for deterrence, so that they go through due process. So they can't just drag you out of your home. They have to actually take you to court, and you have to voluntarily show up and actually go through the process. Now that process may be not completely justified. It still may be fallible, and in many cases it is corrupted, but at least there's some recourse there. You have some opportunity of hope, let's say, in this situation. So you need to look through all these steps and see how, even if it's true, which we know that there's a lot of manipulation here and a lot of fabrication of the truth, but let's say you think it's true. Look at what the political party in power is doing. If they're manipulating you from an emotional point of view, if they're trying to take away your absolute rights, if they're trying to exploit you for a longer term agenda, if they're trying to have leverage over you, even if it's against your opposition, that is something to be very concerned about, because you may be on the same side, you may align with them right now, but that can change. What you want to maintain is a standard of what federal government has in terms of power and what the individual has in terms of power. Keep those two standards the same, consistent. Keep that consistent throughout the next thousands of years. Then no matter what happens, the individual still has power that can go against and be a deterrent against the federal government. In the same way as the federal government they have a lot of power in certain limited responsibilities, they can't go beyond those responsibilities. Once you start to give them more power for a broader range of tasks, and once you degrade the individual, so the individual has less power, and that power is given to a centralized authority, you're creating the new standard that the centralized authority, the federal government, has more power over you in a continuous stance over time. That yields poor results. If we look at history, if that has taught you anything, if you've done any kind of reading, if you've listened to any kind of podcast, even if it's establishment information, even if you're reading a textbook that is mainstream, there are still historical examples in that textbook that portrays when centralized authority gets too much power over the citizen, and the citizen does not have enough power, or they relinquish their power. That's usually when catastrophe occurs, even if you align yourself with the current political party, the ruling power. Now, there are tons of situations, historical examples. If we look at the USSR, for example, if we look at Germany, if we look at any kind of place that had authoritarian power, oftentimes the people did not I'll use USSR and Mao's China, for example. A lot of people supported Mao. A lot of people supported Stalin. Even when there were famines and tens of millions of people were perishing at the hands of the famine, there was a lot of convoluted reasons why there were a famine. A lot of screwed up ideology from the top down, which restricted resources and created regulation to remove the rights of individuals, so they couldn't operate a business, they couldn't operate a farm, etc. But there were a lot of people in those societies, in those nations, that still supported Mao or Stalin, even though there were people around them who were perishing. And it's not like they were so disconnected that they couldn't see people. I mean, of course, When you're in a rural area, you still have to go miles to see people. But there were still people in your community who were suffering. There were still people around you in different cities who were suffering, and you could see it, you could hear about it, you could read about it, even though everything was still censored and restricted to a large extent. You could still go out and see it. And so even the people who are part of the system, who may be aligned with the system, they kind of have Stockholm syndrome, where now you start to develop affection for your kidnapper, for the person who has you held hostage. And it could be a survival mechanism that is an evolutionary trait to align yourself with the ruling, whoever has power over you, even if they're doing ill will to you and or people around you, just to survive. But even the people in those systems, they could see everything around them, and they still yielded to the power. They still cognitively did not understand the ramifications of what was occurring in those societies. Now, we're not at that point yet in the United States. We're at that point in other places in the world, 100%. But we're on the brink of inflation, dollar eroding, assets are being stripped away from the middle class. You have a ton of resources being restricted. Energy is getting more expensive. Food is getting more expensive. You have less options for products and services. You have companies and corporations leaving the competition of the marketplace because they have federal help or there are barriers to entry. And now you have conglomerates, you have oligopolies, in many cases monopolies. We have so far right now great healthcare, but at an expensive cost because it's a monopoly and a lot of, actually oligopoly, where there are a ton of middlemen who control the pricing. There's not transparency. And they control the medical industry. So we're seeing a ton of different industries in the United States of America right now where there is regulation against effectively the individual. So now the individual and the companies that individuals create cannot compete in the marketplace with bigger companies who are established. Politicians do the same. So what we're seeing the erosion of meritocracy. We're seeing the erosion of our political system, of our fiscal system, financial system. We're seeing the erosion of our cultural system, which affects financial and political policy. When you take all those things and you put them together, you create a country that is so weak, it is so easy to take over. And that's exactly what has happened historically through empires in the past. Look in the past, any empire. They've had one or many of the things that I just mentioned contribute to their downfall because now other countries can come in and they can take over. We've already seen countries, they're actively doing this, but they've been doing it for decades, subvert our culture, subvert Hollywood, subvert our different federal agencies, subvert our politicians. In tandem with cultural, fiscal, and political policy degrading, this is a recipe for disaster. There is a solution. It's accountability. It's the same answer every single time. There are levels and layers to accountability. The question is, are you actually going to pursue accountability on these different institutions, or are you going to sit back and keep doing what you've been doing? Because that is not changing anything. That's not finding the answer to the problem that we have. And a lot of people say they may not necessarily see it in their daily life. It's not going to affect them in the short term. It could affect you in the short term. It's a low probability, but it's still possible. But long term, this will affect you. This will affect your kids. This will affect your legacy, everything that you built. You have to ask yourself these questions. You have to dive into these little pockets of information and tackle things where you can. You have a certain skill set. Everyone has a different skill set. You can develop skills as well. And wherever your strengths are, use your strengths for something positive. Use your strengths for something good. When you see that there's erosion in our financial policy and you understand finance really well, try to tackle that. Try to infiltrate that industry from that perspective. Wherever you can bring a skill set, infiltrate that industry and provide some kind of alleviation, some kind of relief. You compound that with all the Americans we have, even if 10 to 20% of Americans, you don't even necessarily have to come together. You just have to infiltrate with your strength. When you provide relief of that magnitude, you compound that effect. We have a better America in the future versus the America where it looks like it's going downhill.